I intend to shake things up a little bit. I hope you're all awake. Thank you, Justin. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I hope they don't regret it. I'm going to talk today about military and intelligence gathering activities in Asian EEZs, the political and legal context. Okay, what are we talking about? Well, a variety of military activities have been taking place, live fire exercises, sub-hunting, like with the impeccable, large fleet exercises, like it's shown in the lower right-hand corner, and of course intelligence gathering, or ISR, by both U-2s and unmanned aircraft. Well, what's the context? We have to put this in context. The context is that the U.S. rebalancing is meeting China's naval expansion, also its own rising capabilities and ambitions. More than that, both China and the U.S. have converging strategic trajectories. What do I mean by that, or what did David Gompert, the deputy head of U.S. intelligence, mean by that? Well, the U.S. says that China has an anti-access area denial concept. This is designed to prevent access in the event of a conflict in the nearshore seas of China, particularly conflict between China and Taiwan. The U.S. or a U.S. response is the air-sea battle concept. You know more about this than I would. But what I do know, and what Gompert knows, is that the tip of the spear for both countries is command, control, communications, computer, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, C4ISR. Both are struggling to control this regime over China's near seas. This is the context of what's going on out there. And it has spawned a series of dangerous incidents. We all know about the EP-3. The Chinese jet collided with it, forced it to land. It was damaged on Hainan Island. We'll get into the details of this a little bit later. Where did this occur? About 75 miles southeast of Hainan. We have the impeccable. Two incidents that we know of were publicized, 2009, 2013. The impeccable, surrounded by Chinese civilian and government vessels, harassed it to stop what it was doing. What was it doing? It was hunting China's nuclear subs. I point this out because it puts equipment in the water. It's active sonar and receiving signals, reflections with sonar buoys. We have the Bowditch, perhaps not as well known as these other incidents. This is an oceanographic survey ship, U.S. Navy. It's been run out of both the East China Sea and the South China Sea by China. When I say run out, asked to leave. And then, of course, just 2 months ago, the Poseidon 8A incident. Note that, well, you all know that Poseidon is a sub-hunter, among other things. Also, that it operates, or can operate, by dropping sonar buoys into the water. This is important, as I'll bring it up a little bit later. All right, China and the U.S. clearly have opposing policies regarding such activities. The U.S. military strategy of 2011 says to safeguard U.S. and partner nation interests, the U.S. will be prepared to demonstrate the will and commit the resources needed to oppose any nation's actions that jeopardizes access to and use of the global commons and cyberspace, or that threatens the security of our allies. A pretty broad statement. Chinese Foreign Ministry, we oppose any military acts in our exclusive economic zone without permission. Other dichotomies, the U.S. should halt its close-in aerial and naval surveillance of China, says General Fan Changlong, Vice Chairman of China's Central Military Commission. Danny Russell, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, says the U.S. is justified in doing these things, because of the lack of transparency in China's military buildup. Operationally, Admiral Greenett has said, we'll continue to operate in international airspace. We made that clear, and we'll proceed. Well, those opposing policies would indicate that a clash may be imminent, at least in some more incidents. Now, meanwhile, the U.S. and China are supposedly building a new relationship, which would avoid the usual conflict between a rising power and an established one. And this will mitigate conflict in Asia and the South China Sea. That's the idea. That's the hope. Results so far, not so good. The greatest risk of accidental hostilities in Asia remains incidents between Chinese and U.S. vessels and aircraft in the East China Sea, around the Senkakus or Diaoyutai, and in the South China Sea over the so-called freedom of navigation issue. Now, you have to understand that this isn't only about the U.S. and China, although that's maybe the scariest scenario, but also Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand also object to military exercises in their EEZs without their consent. And this is just in East Asia. There's maybe 20 countries around the world that have a similar position. Okay, what's going on here? Well, first of all, you have extended jurisdiction. And the perception of the nation, or at least its resource base, is changing. Coastal states naturally want to protect these resources, and they also want to keep maritime powers as far away as possible to reduce the possibility of gunboat diplomacy. Secondly, or thirdly, there's new transnational threats: maritime terrorism, smuggling of WMD, piracy, supplying of arms to insurrections. There's a rise in the size and capabilities of navies. There's an arms competition going on, if not an arms race. There are technological advances in electronics and signal intelligence that have become much more intrusive and active. They're no longer just passive, just listening, just looking. They are intrusive. And then there's fundamental disagreement and confusion over what is and is not allowed at sea in somebody else's zone. Well, to me, these ISR activities may be violating an old military axiom. I don't know if it's a military axiom, maybe it's a Valencia axiom, but don't disturb a sleeping tiger. And it applies to all sides. All right, the legal dimension. First of all, of course, we have the concept of freedom of navigation, sacrosanct and sacred. Really here what the U.S. and others are arguing, that it includes other internationally lawful uses of the sea related to these freedoms. That is ISR and so on. We have dispute over peaceful use, peaceful purpose. What does this mean? Well, it means no threat of use of force. What is a threat of use of force? Nowadays, not when the UN Charter was written. Due regard. You all know, all you officers know, you're supposed to pay due regard to the rights and duties of other states when you operate in their zones, and the coastal state has to pay due regard to your rights and duties. What are the limits? Abuse of rights. They can be abused. And then finally, the conundrum between marine scientific research versus what the U.S. calls military research or military surveys. Not all countries support that distinction. Okay, to cut to the chase, what are the questions that really need to be discussed and debated? Okay, given the strategic context of A2/AD versus ASB, and the role of C4ISR, to use a lot of acronyms, which should be familiar to you, can and or should some of the ELINT and SIGINT activities, for example, probing, tickling, targeting, interfering with communications, be considered a threat of use of force prohibited by the UN Charter, let alone the UNCLOS? Do certain military activities, for example, live fire exercises, take into account the rights and duties of coastal states, for example, to protect marine mammals and their fisheries? Are any of these activities an abuse of freedom of navigation? Can freedom of navigation be abused? Some and the U.S. claim it cannot, that it is absolute. Again, there's disagreement on that. Specifically, are the activities of the Bowditch and the Impeccable, and perhaps the Poseidon, if it was dropping sonar buoys, prohibited by UNCLOS? Article 258, which essentially says if you deploy and use any type of scientific research equipment in the marine environment, it is subject to the same conditions as those prescribed for marine scientific research. In other words, the consent regime. It does not make a distinction between military equipment or marine scientific equipment. And the final question, what exactly is the U.S. doing and why? And given the risk to the U.S.-China relationship that these incidents are causing, is it absolutely necessary? Or can this information be gained in other ways, as some maintain? Well, what's the options here? Well, there's the do-nothing option. That's always very popular. The problem is, by doing nothing, then it leaves the evolution of customary law to state practice. What enough countries do over a long enough period of time becomes customary law, despite the objections of one or two countries, no matter how powerful they may be. Secondly, as we know, and I won't beat on this, but the U.S. has not ratified the convention. So how and why can it interpret certain terms in its own interest or its own favor? Secondly, even if it does eventually, the train has left the station. The meanings of these terms have evolved over the 35 years since the treaty was didn't come into force in 94, but signed in 82. And also, when it was negotiated, the methods of SIGINT and ELINT were not as sophisticated, not as intrusive, not as active as they are today. A renegotiation of these terms nowadays, particularly with a somewhat unfriendly Russia and a risen China, would produce a very different looking text in the law of the sea. I would argue that another option is to get ahead of the curve, to develop agreed voluntary guidelines regarding military and intelligence gathering activities in foreign EEZs. The idea is fairly simple: to discourage provocative, unfriendly acts. Yes, we have cues, and cues is certainly a step in the right direction, but it's mostly communications. And it's not clear that China has embraced it. The Poseidon incident would seem to indicate that it is not, at least not yet, even though it said it would. The problem is that these encounters are not unexpected. They are, in fact, planned and maybe even purposeful. In other words, they are a response, they are unfriendly behavior, no doubt, by the responder to what is perceived as unfriendly behavior on the other side. But they're not unalerted and they're not a big surprise. Okay, there are other objections to guidelines that I've heard, particularly from the US military. China also spies on the US and Japan from their EEZs, so why shouldn't we do it? Well, it's true, China does, increasingly. However, there is a huge difference in capabilities and between passive eavesdropping and active probing, tickling, interference with communications, and violation of the marine scientific research consent regime. Another objection is that the U.S. has the technological advantage and should not be constrained in its use of it. Yes, that's probably true, but that attitude undermines any so-called new relationship that Presidents Obama and Xi Jinping are trying to put in place. And then a third objection is the U.S. did have such understandings with the Soviet Union, but that's because the Soviet Union was an equal, quote-unquote, power. To do so with China would convey a status that it does not deserve and make the U.S. appear weak. Yeah, that's probably true, but again, you can forget about any new relationship with that type of approach and that type of attitude. What can be done? A China-U.S. bilateral agreement is probably the best bet. Other countries would then probably follow it. At Sunnylands, both presidents agreed to develop some rules for behavior in the air and maritime regime, air domain. And supposedly President Obama agreed to this. To what, it's not clear. However, as some of you may know, China experts and US experts are meeting this next week at the Pentagon to discuss exactly that. So the US at least has gone from not willing to discuss to at least to discuss. An alternative, if nothing is done, would be for the region itself, ASEAN perhaps, or an ASEAN-China agreement on such activities, what is friendly, what is unfriendly, some guidelines. The problem with that is that the US would be presented with a fait accompli, and I don't think that would be in the US interest at all. To conclude, for now, the situation is that there are political sharks in the water that we and navies ignore at one's peril. Thank you.